All right. So we're going to do chapter 9, Plato and Aristotle today. I'm going to read it, and you may answer your questions and terms and definitions and while I'm going on. All right. Does that sound good? So you can pull that up right now. Come on in. I'm getting ready to get started. All right. Plato. Like Socrates, Plato was born in Athens and spent his life as a philosopher, searching for the truth. Plato was not only a brilliant thinker, but also a brilliant writer. He wrote down many of his ideas, and his dialogues are still widely read today. Now, here I'm going to read you the definition of dialogue right here. A piece of writing organized as a conversation between two or more characters. Okay, so you're teaching actually a lesson by using dialogue as an example. Remember when we talked about Jesus and his teachings, they were used and he would teach a parable. Remember, he would tell a story in order to get to a lesson. You have to, yes, go quickly. Okay, so this right here is the same thing. He used dialogues. So since I'm so far away from you guys, I'm going to take this off. All right, I'm taking it off. You guys can't. Well, I'm like 10 feet away from you guys. All right.
10 feet. 6 feet apart.
Okay, hold on. No.
I'm not really 6 feet apart.
All right. I missed my place here.
Only want to take his mask off. 10 feet.
All right, you ready? Plato was about 24 when the Peloponnesian War ended. Remember, it ended in the year 404 BCE. Okay. So he would have been old enough to have fought maybe at the end part of the war. He was a student of Socrates. When Socrates was executed, Plato fled Athens and other students with other students of Socrates. Because their teacher had been executed, they felt like they were not welcomed in Athens. Plato traveled from place to place for a number of years. He even visited Italy and Sicily. Eventually, he returned to Athens in 387 BCE, so that was about 17 years after the end of the war. Okay, he started a school called the Academy. This school lasted more than 900 years until the Roman Emperor Justinian, who reigned from 527 CE to 564 CE, closed it down because it did not teach Christianity. Isn't that ironic, huh, that the Romans did that? You're going to see why it's even more ironic in the next unit, because we'll be talking about ancient Rome. The dialogues. Here's that, what you were asking about earlier. In some of his early dialogues, Plato tried to write down conversations that Socrates had actually had with others. He wanted to let people know what Socrates had said. In his later dialogues, Plato still used the dialogue from form, but used it to treat new subjects. These dialogues were not necessarily based on the things Socrates had actually said. Rather, Plato tried to imagine what his beloved teacher Socrates might have said about various subjects. You remember, Socrates never wrote anything. So everything we know about Socrates actually comes from the writings of Plato. Thank goodness he wrote it down about his teacher, because the teacher never wrote anything down. Okay, by writing dialogues, Plato allowed his readers to imagine that they were part of a great philosophical conversation. He encouraged them to think about their own opinions and ideas, and he showed them that they could use reason to discover the truth. Although Plato wrote Socratic dialogues, his way of searching for truth and trying to understand goodness differed from the methods used by Socrates. Plato was more idealistic than his teacher. He spent more time trying to understand what the ideal or perfect example of goodness was, and less time trying to help people recognize whether they were actually living it. Plato was also more traditional in his teaching methods. He didn't confront people in the street or in the marketplace. Like many other philosophers, he had regular students whom he taught. However, before people could study Plato, they had to have mastered mathematics. Plato felt the philosophers should play a central role in society because they alone understood the meaning of truth and the meaning of justice. He did not believe in democracy. He thought it gave power to people who did not understand justice, people who did wicked things, such as execute Socrates. Plato wanted society to be like a school in which citizens spent their lives training to be good people, just as in Sparta they trained to be good soldiers. He imagined an ideal state ruled by philosophers and dedicated to justice. So he didn't want the people to have the power like in democracy where everybody has a voice, okay? Or in Athens where every, male that owns land had a voice. He believed that you should have a group of philosopher kings, right, that made the decisions for everyone else. Here, citizens could develop virtue within themselves. What is virtue? That means a high moral standard, okay, within themselves and choose goodness. Plato believed that the right kind of education would teach citizens to control themselves, to act for the good of others, and to be less selfish. In his dialogue, The Republic, he describes his ideal state. During the lifetime of Socrates, philosophers were involved in the life of the polis. What is another word for polis? City. Remember? Okay. They tried to educate citizens and get them involved. By the time Plato was teaching and writing, things had changed. The role of the philosopher was still to train citizens, but it was also important for a philosopher to use his knowledge to point out how society was not always what it could be. Philosophers taught in schools rather than conversing in the marketplace or debating in the assembly. They tried to identify what was wrong with society and made suggestions for how it could be better. However, they were not directly involved in everyday life of the polis as earlier philosophers had been. When the great philosopher Aristotle came along, he made even more changes in what philosophers did and how they worked. Aristotle. Now, remember, like I said, Socrates was the teacher of Plato. Now, and Plato was probably his greatest student. Now you're going to see Aristotle is going to be the student of Plato, and he's going to be probably the greatest student of Plato. Just as Socrates found a great student in Plato, so Plato found a great student in Aristotle. Aristotle was born around 384 BCE in Macedonia, a country north of Greece. There, his father had been a doctor in the court of the king, Amyntas III. When Aristotle came to Athens, he studied with Plato and stayed at Plato's school for 20 years. God bless you. Before starting his own school called the Lyceum. Aristotle was greatly influenced both by his father and by Plato. His father had influenced him because in ancient times, knowledge and skills were passed from father to son. Aristotle's father was a doctor. As a doctor, he had to take careful note of a patient's symptoms or signs of illness to understand what was making that patient sick. He taught Aristotle to observe people and the world around him carefully. Plato taught Aristotle how important abstract ideals. Well, first of all, before we go any further, are you familiar with the word abstract? Okay. Right here, they give you a really good definition. It says relating to ideas rather than concrete objects, more relating to an idea, okay, and not necessarily something concrete. Yes, sir.
Isn't that abstract something? Does it have to do something in painting also?
Oh yeah, abstract painting as well. That's where you get the term abstract painting, because you're not dealing like in an ideal form. You're dealing in a form that you can see, like in your mind. All right. Disagreed and argued with each other from time to time. Aristotle admired Plato greatly, but he once said, "Plato is dear to me, but dearer to me still is truth. So, in other words, yeah, I like them, but I'm more interested in learning about the truth. All right. All right. Let me go on. A keen observer. Aristotle also added to the knowledge of his day by collecting and examining insects, animals, and plants. He loved to study animals. He dissected more than 50 different types of animals in order to learn about them. From his years of careful observation, Aristotle realized that there is always more than one way to explain things. For example, an animal could be understood by what it looked like, what it was made of, how it moved, and what it could do. All these different explanations were important and necessary. Aristotle didn't know it, but by collecting facts, analyzing them, and coming up with theories and observations, he was developing the basics of scientific research. It's true that Aristotle didn't go as far as later philosophers did in testing out his ideas. Some of his ideas turned out to be wrong. However, he helped move philosophy down the path to what would eventually become a modern science. God bless you. Like other philosophers, Aristotle also wrote about what it meant to lead a good and just life. He believed that the purpose of life was to exercise one's abilities and virtues reasonably. In his book, Nicomachean, say that together, Nicomachean Ethics, he said, virtue, therefore, is a kind of moderation or mean, as it aims at the mean or moderate amount. Now, before I go any further, you know the term mean in mathematics? Like, you know, the mean, median, and mode? Okay. Right here, a place between two extremes. Well, isn't that the same thing as in mathematics? The mean is where? Somewhere in the middle, right? Yes, ma'am. You may. You trying to wake up? All right, stretch. Okay. Aristotle meant that people should avoid extremes of all kinds. Just as they should eat neither too much or too little, they should also avoid both evil deeds on the one hand and self-righteousness in the other hand. Aristotle believed that a truly virtuous man is neither cowardly nor foolishly brave. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Let me scroll up a little. Aristotle wrote, "It is possible to feel fear, confidence, desire, anger, pity, but to feel these emotions all at the right times, on the right occasions, and toward the right people in the right ways is always the best course. The idea of living moderately is sometimes called the golden mean." That is a quote. I mean, that is I think one of your terms that I put on your list, because that's just like, that's still used today. Like, you've heard, you may not have heard this before, but you'll hear older people, they'll say, "I live the golden mean," or "I live by the golden mean." In other words, not too high, not too low, just right. Just like the three little bears, or the three bears, like the little bear's porridge. It wasn't too hot, it wasn't too cold, it was just right. All right. Aristotle also examined politics, or the life of the state. He was interested in determining the best kinds of governments. He wanted to identify which types of governments care for the citizens and not just the rulers. So he inspected dozens of city states. In his book, The Politics, Aristotle wrote that the purpose of the state was to make the good life possible for its citizens. The state should create a society in which people could live nobly, honorably, and well. A man of his time. Aristotle was a man of his time. However, he did not believe that all people were equal. He valued men over women. He believed that aristocrats were morally superior than non-aristocrats. He also believed in slavery. He felt that an enslaved person was the property of the slave owner, just as a tool was his property. Aristotle's influence lasted for centuries. During the European Middle Ages, he was so important that he was referred to simply as the philosopher. The great Athenian philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, taught each other to use reason to examine their lives, society, and the world around them. Much of what we know and think about today is based on the principles of reason and observation that began with these philosophers in ancient Greece.